Well, welcome everybody to Downtown Harbor Church. If it is your first time here, my name is John. I'm lead pastor. Appreciate you coming on out. So today we are wrapping up this series we've been in called Daniel, where for the last 4 weeks we've been looking at this Old Testament figure and specifically kind of looking at the various times in his life when he took a stand for God. And our goal throughout this is to find out what it looks like for us to take a stand in our lives for the right things at the right time and in the right way. So today what I want to do as we wrap up is I want to have a conversation about what it looks like for us to stand firm in our faith, to stand firm in our faith. Because I believe that for some of you here today, or some of you watching online, I believe there's some of you here who have been praying for a long time, believing that God would do something, and yet you haven't seen God move. That in spite of all of your prayers, you've not seen any results. And maybe you're praying for a wayward child. Maybe you've been praying to have a child. Maybe you've been praying to find a spouse or to find employment or to save your marriage. If I've just described you, my prayer all week, even today before I walked up on stage, is that God would minister to your heart. In fact, today's message is a very simple one, with a singular in nature, with a goal. And the goal is this: I want you guys to feel encouraged. I want you to, those of you who've been crying out to God for him to move in your life, I want you to leave today feeling encouraged, empowered, and energized. So let me kind of set the scene for our final story. In week 1, if you were here and if you weren't here, we learned that King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon went into Jerusalem and ransacked it. Just destroyed it, destroyed the temple. He then took Jews captive, tens of thousands of them, brought them back into captivity in Babylon. And for the last 80 years, last 4 weeks, last 80 years, Daniel has been praying that God would move, that God would restore Jerusalem, he would restore the temple, that God would release his fellow Jews from bondage. Well, one day, God gives Daniel a vision. Now, we don't know what the vision is, but Daniel, it says, understood that the vision concerned events certain to happen in the future, times of war and great hardship. And Daniel was just so discouraged by this, okay? Because in spite of praying for 80 long years, in spite of decades of prayer, praying that things would get better for the Jews, it now seems like there's just no end in sight. The story continues. When this vision came to me, I, Daniel, had been in mourning for 3 weeks. All that time, I'd eaten no rich food, no meat or wine crossed my lips. I used no fragrant lotions until those 3 weeks had passed. So for 21 days, Daniel is fasting and he's praying. Now, why do we fast? Well, there's a number of reasons Scripture talks about, but at its core, we fast in order to help us focus on God. Okay, kind of removes the distractions from our life and super concentrates, if you will, our prayer life. And at the end of 21 days of crying out to the Lord, God gives Daniel a second vision. He says this: on April 23rd, very specific, as I was standing on the bank of the great Tigris River, I looked up and I saw a man. Let's pause. Daniel's about to go into great detail about this man that he saw. And there's all kinds of theological debate as to who exactly this man is. Now, I'm going to read it to you. I want to let it just sort of wash over you. You can internalize it and form your own opinion. And then I'm going to tell you what the scholars think is going on here. Daniel says, I looked up and I saw a man dressed in linen clothing with a belt of pure gold around his waist. His body, he says, looked like a precious gem. His face flashed like lightning and his eyes flamed like torches. His arms and feet shone like polished bronze, and his voice roared like a vast multitude of people. That's quite a description. Many theologians believe that Daniel has just come in contact with what we call the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. Pre-incarnate meaning before flesh. Remember, Jesus has been around since always. He's never not existed. He only put on flesh, so to speak, 2,000 years ago. So why do theologians believe that this right here is the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ? The reason they think that is because it sounds strikingly similar to John's description of the glorified Jesus in heaven. Here's what John saw in heaven, and he writes it down in the book of Revelations, speaking of Jesus. He was dressed in a long robe with a gold strip of cloth around his chest. The hair on his head was white like wool, as white as snow. His eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze metal glowing in a furnace. His voice sounded like rushing waters. Basically identical. Okay, so it is completely appropriate to conclude that this man that Daniel saw was in fact the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. Now, other theologians believe that it was an angel. Some believe it might be Gabriel, who got often used to bring announcements. I don't know where I fall in all that. But whoever it is, this man is being sent to Daniel on behalf of God. The story goes on. Only I, Daniel, saw the vision. The men with me saw nothing, but they were suddenly terrified and ran away to hide. If you're familiar with the New Testament, you might remember that something very similar happened to Paul on the road to Damascus. The resurrected Jesus Christ appeared to him. He saw him, but his traveling companions saw nothing. They couldn't see it. They could hear it, but they couldn't see anything. Here's what I love about what's going on with Daniel and Paul. It really speaks to this idea that there are times in our life where God has something just for you. Just for you. Maybe that happened today during music for you. You know, maybe it was just a note, or it was a verse, or a word, or a chorus, and it was as though God was just speaking directly to you. And, you know, maybe you leaned over to the person next to you and you go, wow, how amazing was that? And they look at you and they go, amazing? I mean, the coffee's okay, right? It's as though they didn't hear the same song you did. They completely missed it. Happens a lot with sermons. I'll, preach a message up here and afterwards someone goes, not my favorite. It's just like, okay, happens sometimes. 10 minutes later, somebody else goes, John, it was like you were speaking right to me. I felt like I was the only person in the room. Same message, different experience. Now, your individual experience has nothing to do with me or Bernie or Kimberly or anybody up here on stage. It is simply what happens when God has something for you. And in that moment, I firmly believe the God of this universe is reaching out across time and space to touch your heart and to speak to you. That's how much he loves you. So Daniel's having this moment with God. He says, so I was left all alone to see this amazing vision. My strength left me. My face grew deathly pale, and I felt very weak. Then I heard the man speak, and when I heard the sound of his voice, I fainted and lay there with my face to the ground. If you've ever had a moment where you truly experience God, you get this. You get this. It's like you have no words. You're brought to tears. You are filled with awe. Your spirit trembles, if you will. Now, I can tell you this, I rarely have that type of experience with God on a Sunday, mainly because I'm just kind of full of adrenaline doing this, and so my mind is not that quiet. But I can tell you when I do have this type of God moment, when I'm watching The Chosen. Okay? Listen, I've been watching this show for about 2 years. I'm still on season 2. I can't make it through an episode, okay, without having an overwhelming God moment where I just got to shut it off because it's too much. And I don't know about you, but it happens at the most random times. There's one scene, okay, the last episode I watched, one scene. The disciples are dealing with this demoniac, this demon-possessed person, and they can't control him. I mean, it's bad. I think he's fighting with Simon the Zealot, if I remember correctly. And it's getting, and then out of nowhere, out of frame, you just hear Jesus go, get out, just like that, get out. And boom, demon's gone. And I don't know what it was about that, but I was just overwhelmed with the power of God. I ugly cried. It happens every episode. I was just weeping without words. I turned it off. I had to walk away. That's Daniel right now. He's overwhelmed with the presence of the Lord. It says, just then, a hand touched me and lifted me, still trembling, to my hands and knees. And the man said to me, Daniel, you are very precious to God. Some of you here today don't realize that you are precious to God. And maybe you don't realize it because no one ever taught you that before. Last series, we did a series here called Like a Child. I don't know if you were with us. And we adapted the DHC Kids curriculum to you as adults. Well, last Sunday, just literally last Sunday, My daughter upstairs with the kids department learned such an important truth. She learned that God made Charlotte wonderful. This is hers. And I'm putting this up here because I want you to know that God made you wonderful. You are valuable to God. I don't know if you know that. You are precious to God. Jesus would say you were worth dying for. And I've said this before and I'll say it again. There's nothing you can do to make God love you more. And there's nothing you could do to make God love you less. Daniel, this man says, you're very precious to God. So listen carefully to what I have to say. And I would say the same thing to you right now. If you've zoned out, come back in. Listen up. If you are someone who has been praying for God to move for a long time, and you have not seen God move, then what you're about to hear has the potential to change your life. Man says, don't be afraid, Daniel. Since the first day you began to pray, since the first day you began to pray for understanding and to humble yourself before God, your request has been heard in heaven, and I have come to answer your prayer. If you are someone who's been praying for a long time, years even, and you're starting to wonder, is it even worth it? Am I wasting my time? I mean, is God even hearing my prayers? This messenger from God is letting you know that the first time you prayed, God heard your cry. The moment you released that prayer into God's hands, he received it. The first time you prayed for your child. The first time you prayed for healing. The first time you prayed for your marriage, God heard it. But we may ask, why aren't we seeing any results? Why aren't we seeing any movement, any action? Why is it that we have been praying and it appears as though God is doing nothing? This divine messenger is about to let you in on a little secret. And that is that sometimes there's a lot more going on behind the scenes than you could ever imagine. So he says to Daniel, God heard your prayer the first time. I am here to answer your prayers. But for 21 days, he says, which, if you remember, is the length of time that Daniel had been fasting. But for 21 days, this messenger says, the spirit prince of the kingdom of Persia blocked my way. Then Michael, one of the archangels, came to help me, and I left him there with the spirit prince of the kingdom of Persia. What? Huh? What is going on here in verse 13? I want to walk you through what's happening here. Now, I'm going to tell you this. You're never going to hear this in another church. I mean, maybe you will. I never had before. This is something you learn in seminary, and quite frankly, it just never leaves the classroom, but I want you here at this church to be aware of this. The best way that I could describe to you as to what you are reading in verse 13 is what you're seeing is a specific, geographical, real-world example of Satan's power on earth. Now, I actually reached out to an old professor to make sure that I was stating this correctly. Okay, so allow me to pull back the curtain for just a moment on the spiritual world. We're familiar with Satan, right? We call him the devil. In John 16, Jesus actually tells us that Satan has a title. Here's Jesus talking about Satan. He says that's because the devil, the prince of this world, has already been judged. So Satan, according to Jesus, is the prince of this world. That is his official title. So we got a prince. Okay, put that over here. Paul then takes it a step further to kind of flesh out the evil that we see in this world. In Ephesians 6, Paul tells us this, for we are not fighting against flesh and blood enemies, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world. Other translations say powers and principalities. Okay, what do we do with all this? Based on what Jesus has said, and based on what Paul is saying, what becomes clear is that there is some type of evil hierarchical structure that has been laid over this earth. There are princes, rulers, authorities, powers, principalities. Okay. Where did all this come from? Well, we don't have a ton of information on this. We have one verse. And whenever you have one verse, you got to be careful. But we got one verse. And it's a hotly debated verse at that. In Deuteronomy 32:8, we read this. When God Most High divided up the nations, when he divided up humankind, he decided the people's boundaries based on the number of the gods. And the Hebrew word here for the gods is used elsewhere to describe evil beings. So it would appear, theologians would argue, that when Satan and his army get kicked out of heaven, God divided up the earth, created nations, and allowed each area to be governed by an evil entity with Satan as the prince of this world. And in Daniel's case, for 21 days, the spirit prince of the kingdom of Persia blocked that messenger's way. Now, let me make this practical for us, right? Because it's not a Bible study. It's not just interesting information. What do we do with this? Okay. If what I've laid out to you is correct, and again, this is theory, okay? But if what I've laid out to you is correct, that means that there is most likely a spirit prince of America. Some entity over Florida. Someone over Broward County. One over Fort Lauderdale, maybe even your street. Which is why our battle is not against flesh and blood, as Paul would say, but against the powers and the principalities of the unseen world. Here's why this is so important. For 80 years and 21 days, Daniel prayed and saw nothing. But just because we don't see anything doesn't mean God isn't doing something, because unbeknownst to Daniel, God heard that prayer the first time. He dispatched his angels immediately, and for 3 weeks, God engaged in battle in order to answer Daniel's prayer. And it makes me wonder, what if right now, I mean, in this moment, as we speak, maybe even in this room, God is battling for you. So you thought your prayers didn't make it past the ceiling, didn't you? But what if all around you, heaven's forces are waging war to save your marriage, fighting to help your children, wrestling to bring you peace? Maybe you've been praying for weeks, months, and years, and you've seen nothing. But what if all this time God has been orchestrating an answer to your prayer, moving the pieces of your life around like chess in order to accomplish your requests? See, the truth is, God heard your prayer the first time. He continues to hear them. We simply don't realize how much is going on behind the scenes. So your job, my job, our job is to stand firm in our faith, to keep praying because God is coming. But let's get real for a moment. You're tired, aren't you? You're beaten. You're drained. You might be on the verge of giving up because you've been praying for years. Some of you are going to get to a place in your faith where you got nothing left. You're at the end of your strength. But Scripture says that when you're weak, then you're strong, because that's when God's power is most real. And I would argue that until you fully embrace your weakness, you will never fully experience and appreciate the strength of God. Daniel describes it like this: my strength is gone, and I can hardly breathe. This captures where some of you are right now, doesn't it? My strength is gone. I've been hanging on to this marriage. My strength is gone. I am at the end of my financial rope. My strength is gone. I've been praying for God to move. My strength is gone, Daniel would say. I can hardly breathe. Then the one who looked like a man touched me again, and I felt my strength returning. For some of you, this is what you needed today. This right here is your God moment. One touch, and your faith is restored. One touch, and you're coming back to Christ. One touch, and you're believing God for that thing you stopped believing in Him years ago. One touch, and it's enough to keep you going. Just one touch. Everything changes. Daniel says, one touch, I felt my strength returning. Don't be afraid, he said, for you are very precious to God. Peace. Be encouraged. Be strong. See, you can stand firm in your faith because the first time you prayed, God heard you. He releases angelic forces on your behalf, and God may do exactly what you've prayed for. Or He may not. But we can trust him no matter what because he loves us and he knows what's best for us. And just because you don't see anything doesn't mean that God isn't doing something. So what's the practical? What do you do with a message like this? If it's your first time here at Downtown Harbor Church, every single week we put this word on the screen because we want to make sure you can leave on a Sunday and know exactly what to do with what you've heard. So in light of today's story, I just have one question for you. What is that one thing you've been praying for? What's that one thing? I'm sure it's been on your mind the whole day. What's that one thing you're so concerned about, so burdened over that you can't stop thinking about it? Maybe it is that wayward child. Maybe it's a marriage that's on the rocks. Maybe it's a health scare that you're dealing with right now. What is that one thing that you are so passionate about that you can't help but knock on the doors of heaven every day and every night? Lord, answer me. Lord, answer me. Lord, if you don't move, it's not going to happen. When Jesus taught about prayer, he emphasized one thing more than anything else. He says, when you pray, don't give up. And just because heaven seems silent, keep asking. And just because nobody's answering the door today, you keep knocking because you have no idea what's happening behind that door. You got no idea what's going on behind the scenes. You have no idea the battles that are being waged at this very moment on your behalf. So you keep sending those prayers up to heaven, trusting that God heard them the first time and is working for you because he loves you. Now I want to do something a little bit different today. I believe that there really is a special power in this room when a body of believers comes together to worship God. I believe that with all my heart. And what I want to do today is I just want to harness that power for just a time of prayer. Just for the next 2-3 minutes, I just want to give you an opportunity in your seats where you don't need to kneel, you don't have to come forward, you don't have to put your hands up, just between you and the Lord in the presence of other believers. Just to call on God and ask him to move visibly in your life today. That perhaps today would be the day, if it is his will, that his answer comes. Now, for those of you here who perhaps at this moment don't have this burden that we're talking about, this thing that you're just praying for and praying for and praying for, and that might be a lot of you. If that's you, I want to challenge you to do battle on behalf of others. And you don't need to know their name. You do not need to know their story because God knows it all. But for the next 2 minutes or so, as Bernie quietly plays, I just want to challenge you. In your own way, go before God, praying for those in this room who are in desperate need of answered prayer. Pray that God would bind the hands of the enemy, that he would move in a powerful and visible way in the lives of your fellow DHC friends. After an appropriate amount of time, Bernie will close us out in a song. So would you go before the Lord in prayer?